Welcome to The Learning Core, a podcast by Telos on the Telos channel. Together, we'll interrogate the core issues of conflict with experts from around the world and uncover the path forward toward creative action in our communities. My name is Sarah Sturm, and I'm your host. Today, we're beginning a series of conversations about nonviolence. At Telos, we believe that active nonviolence promotes freedom and justice and is grounded in a spirit of love and hope. Creative and clear resistance against all forms of violence, direct, structural, and cultural, heals our world and paves the path to reconciliation. Just peacemaking is a courageous, countercultural, and purpose-driven way of life. For this conversation, I'm joined by Shadia Qubti as we dive into what creative and clear resistance to injustice has looked like in her life and advocacy, especially theologically. Shadia is a Palestinian Christian who has worked in peacebuilding and advocacy initiatives for 15 years. She's particularly focused on amplifying the voices and perspectives of women and other minorities in a variety of ways, one of which was in the Women Behind the Wall podcast. Shadia was born and raised in Nazareth. She studied international relations and English language at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and conflict resolution and nonviolent action at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. She's completed another master's in Indigenous and Interreligious Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology, where her thesis attempted to hold a theological conversation between Palestinian and North American Indigenous understandings of land. Shadia is currently working at Trinity Grace United Church in Vancouver as the Community Engagement Coordinator. Shadia, thanks so much for joining us on the Learning Core podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here today.
I'd love to dive right in and start with giving you the opportunity to tell our listeners a little bit more about who you are. You grew up in Nazareth, you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel. What's important for us to know about the context in which you grew up or the community you come from for us to understand your work and your story?
Sure. So my name is Shadia, and I'm a Palestinian Christian. I grew up in Nazareth, and as you said, Nazareth is the one of the largest Palestinian populations inside the Green Line on the Israeli recognized borders. So that means I have an Israeli citizenship. So my upbringing, I had to navigate multiple identities, primarily as a minority, right? So I'm a minority Palestinian among an Israeli Jewish majority, and then I'm a minority Christian among a majority Muslim Palestinian community. I'm also a woman. I think some might regard it as a minority, maybe not demographically, but let's say maybe the power dynamics. I also grew up, my paternal ancestry is Coptic. My maternal ancestry is Greek Orthodox, but both my parents were practicing Baptist by the time I was born. So even within the Christian landscape, that's a very small minority as well. So yeah, I think growing up in Nazareth has been really a privilege. It's a beautiful place to grow up. It's very relatively quiet, away from kind of the news and the violence that we hear a lot about. Nazareth didn't have as much violent encounters, except for maybe one time a year for land day commemorations. So in some ways, I grew up a relatively normal childhood, as normal as can be growing up in Israel, Palestine, but really trying to navigate and embrace different elements of my identity and how to navigate it in a context that's quite divided and very violent at times like these. Yeah, we can tell a lot of stories of just growing up and normalizing kind of the context and the conflict from a child's perspective. But yeah, I think kind of hoping we can unpack some of these identities as we continue in our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I think I can hear that you're sitting in the midst of a lot of tensions, right? A lot of questions of community and richness and belonging, and then also otherness and trying to find space within that. I'd love to start with that Christian identity, in part because, as I've learned more about you and your work, it's clear that that is something that's really important to you and to how you choose to do your work and show up in activism, whatever activism looks like. I know that means different things to different people, but I'd love to start with that. How does your faith or religious identity impact how you engage in activism? Or conversely, how does activism affect your Christian identity when it comes to your work in the Holy Land?
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the informative part of my identity has been my Christian identity. And I mean, growing up in a evangelical conservative setting, really a lot of the teachings of Jesus were focused on, if you've are of my generation, a lot of those like felt, using felt to tell stories about different journeys of Jesus or Old Testament stories. But I think one of the main things that that's still impactful in my life today is just the focus on God's universal love for everyone, right? The unconditional love. And then as I grew up, I think trying to take those teachings and those values and see them in a context that's so divided, in a context that's so exclusive. And I think different parts of my life trying to embrace those teachings in a contemplative or in a contemporary way of how do we love each other in a context where enemies are pronounced. There are enemies, or you are seen as an other in that context. And so a lot of the teachings kind of become real, whether it's the stories of the Good Samaritan or the Samaritan woman at the well, or even grappling with women in the Bible as well, right? Where's our voice? Where's our agency when we read scripture throughout? And I think that's kind of more on the spiritual formation part. But also my Christian identity in Israel Palestine, it's a lineage, it's heritage, it's your status as well. So as I said, like if I grew up Coptic, and the Copts can trace their lineage back to the mission or the outreach of the Apostle Mark. So, on one hand, our existence there is a continuation. It's what we call ourselves like the fifth gospel of the presence of Christians since Christianity began, and we have kind of maintain our Christian identity throughout. So just by saying my last name, you're also identifying my Christian heritage in that way. And on the other hand, I think also the Christian presence in Israel, Palestine, it tells the story of Christian mission. So both my parents have benefited a lot from the Baptist mission, whether it's through a school or through an orphanage because of the Nakba that my mom grew up in. But I was also born in a Christian hospital that goes back to the Christian Mission Society, which is the same organization that established the Al Ahli Hospital in Gaza, for example. So I think in many ways, being a Christian, I think has been in my journey and has brought me here. But at the same time, right now, with what's going on in Gaza, you also see the destruction of these missions that have been in place for more than a century. And that question is, a lot of these questions resonate in terms of what is the presence of Christians, but also Christian mission in light of the great catastrophes that are taking place in Israel, Palestine.
There's such huge questions to be asking, both for you, for everyone who cares about what happens in the Holy Land, but I think also for our network. And there's so many pieces I want to pick up on. But I think part of what you were talking about with spiritual formation is what we invite people into too, is to think about what a different way of engaging the Holy Land through their Christian faith can look like, right? There's a lot of Christian Zionism out there that's not the focus of our conversation today, but that's a theology that we invite people to interrogate and to try and leave behind, to embrace one that's rooted in peacemaking and mutual flourishing. But I think that second piece that you were talking about too, with Christian mission or programs or presence, there has historically been really strong, good work done by Christians and communities of faith. And I think in that there's an invitation for people today, whether they're in the Telos network or beyond, to figure out how to continue that, whether it's through financial support for the humanitarian crisis right now, advocacy to end the conditions that cause that crisis, or other really concrete ways to be a presence and an influence for good in very, concrete material ways, recognizing the challenging history and the relationship and all of that. But that's super helpful for you to set up for us and to dive into.
Yeah, I think I want to respond in two things. I think in my own journey right now is also deconstructing some of those missions that came here, especially those that are directly connected to my families, that have influenced and positively impacted my family, but also reading and coming to terms and reading from their perspective. I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention was kind of were the missionaries who really impacted my family, but also coming to terms and reading kind of their views and how they looked at us and how they saw us in ways. It's been really a journey of pain, but also of praise, because even though a lot of the Southern Baptists who have been sent, some of them were very Orientalist. They saw us as, in the same way a lot of the first contact writing has been with indigenous peoples elsewhere, right? We were the uncivilized, we were the savages, we were kind of looked at as less than. But that also reminds me of the story of Joseph, that perhaps what maybe people had intended to do, or regardless of how they saw us, God used it for good, right? And in some ways, how do you embrace these two elements in your own upbringing? On one hand, because of mission, you've been given opportunities, and my quality of life has improved, but at the same time, you also know that not everyone had the same grace towards you or saw you as equal. Really, it's again this theme of navigating these different tensions in your identities and these different lineage of our identities. And I think the second element is also, I think, me looking at my spiritual upbringing. I think what resonated a lot with my context, and I took it as a vocation, is the call to be peacemakers, right? I mean, whether it's the larger macro story of our scripture of God sending his one and only son to kind of reconcile us to him, and then really feeling strongly about that call that we should extend the same grace, the same reconciliation to others. And I took it seriously in my upbringing, and I wanted to be a peacemaker in my context, right? Enemies are pronounced. We have enemies, and we are called to love our enemies. So I really engaged in a lot of dialogue groups to try to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, and then I think I did it for more than 15 years, but I became disillusioned with that process because, at the end of the day, I think the issue isn't about Palestinians and Israelis. It's not the issue that we get along or we don't know each other. But I think what I've been disillusioned with is that there is a system of injustice. There's a system that's built on treating people based on something they can't even control differently. So because I was born Palestinian, I don't get same rights. I'm not treated in an equal way to someone who's an of Israeli Jewish background. And I think, as much as I still believe in peace, and I still believe that we can live together in equality and dignity, but there is an issue of, you have to decide at what point is the current path you're taking to peace the correct one, or is it appropriate, timely for what's happening, or you have to readjust. And I think for me, that's been a process that's been very painful, to ask these questions out loud and try to grapple with them in my own way, in my own journey.
Shadia, this is making me think of the different ways we talk about violence. There's 3 different types that we often think of: cultural, structural, and direct. Direct violence is, right, a punch or a bomb being dropped. Structural violence are things like the occupation, checkpoints. And then cultural violence are the logics or beliefs that make the other 2 possible and seem normal. And I think what you just said around the limits of dialogue groups, they do fantastic work addressing some of the cultural violence around otherizing. But they don't always go far enough when it comes to trying to transform the structural violence or the right systems of injustice, as you say. And I think that that's part of what I want to invite people to think about with this idea of a vocation as a peacemaker. It's not just about relationship. It's not just about, that kind of kumbaya, getting along, seeing each other as equal human beings. It's once you've embraced that, what do you do with it? How do you put that into action to transform unjust structures and lived realities into just peace? And I think going back to your previous point, or what we were talking about around an international Christian conceptualization of Palestinian Christians, that's part of this too. One of our other practices is centering the leadership of the marginalized. And I know different people resonate with that idea of marginalization differently. But what I mean by that is just that those who are closest to a problem or most impacted by it have the greatest insights into solutions and the greatest skin in the game when it comes to needing to be centered in leading the movements to transform that violence. And all of this is, coming up for me in this conversation, because I think that that's That's part of it, right? It's an invitation for international Christians to center the leadership, stories, narratives, and identities of Palestinian Christians and what you all are saying as people rooted in the land. And also, when it comes to peacemaking efforts, at the same time, the same thing, right? Centering the leadership of folks trying to transform structures and not just these narratives. So I would love to hear anything you have to say in response to those framings.
Yeah, I think it's the structural violence or structural peace in the sense like it exists everywhere, right? I mean, we all live in non-perfect structures. And to some degree, I think we also need to be aware and have these lenses of the importance of being a diverse community, whether small scale or big scale, because we do have inherent blind spots. And I think including marginalized voices that don't have a normal place on the table, that really helps us be better. That really helps us to be the true agents of peace that our scriptures is full of. And I think that's important. I think what you're doing and that call to always be seeking who is not on the table and why not bring them in, because we do have these blind spots that we are not perfect. I mean, in the same way, I think as a Palestinian Christian, I have a lineage of a lot of legends before me that have paved the road to being nonviolent, to resist in a way that is life-giving for me and for Palestinian Christians. And I think throughout our history, we have taken a nonviolent approach, which is very gratifying, which is very rewarding, and I hope to continue on that path. But I also I think in my own journey, I also realized that structural violence is not only in our contemporary world. I think it's also in our scripture. A lot of us struggle with like the violence that's in our Bibles, and when we read it, I think some of us have reached that point. Some of us still read the Bible in these romanticized, sensitized eyes. But I think for me, it happened when all of a sudden I'm coming to terms with a lot of violence that was perpetrated in the Old Testament, and how do we grapple with it in a reality as today, and in a world that we are trying to rid ourselves or reduce the violence. And it's been hard. It's been hard to kind of say it out loud and say, you know what, there are parts in our scripture that are quite violent, and not sure how to deal with that. And you see it being repeated again and again by leadership, that saying, well, because there is violence in the Bible, or because the Canaanites or the Hittites or all these tribes were annihilated, kind of calling for permission to do the same. And it plays on our, I think, sensitized eyes of reading the Bible as sacred. But we also need to be wary that these people, some of them still exist today, and some of their stories aren't heard. And we need to be very, very careful how we weaponize our Bible to justify violence perpetrated today as well.
That's such an important point. And personally, my background is more in the academic field around religious literacy. And one of the principles that I think is so important for everyone to understand is that religions are not inherently peaceful or violent, right? In almost every theological text, you can read into it what you're looking to find. You can find justifications for perpetuating violence, and you can find really robust frameworks for just peace. And I'm wondering if we also talked about, right, there's so many examples of wonderful nonviolent actors. Part of what we need is imagination, as it's seeing, reading, theologizing nonviolent resistance in a way that is invitational and seems possible. I'm wondering if there are any stories that come to mind that you'd like to share that have inspired you or grounded your own commitment to nonviolence that you would like to share with our listeners.
I mean, I think what I think about from our conversation is it connected to my research. Just to say briefly, kind of introduce it a bit, as part of my own journey to regain hope, or maybe look at my context differently, is I went to study, and I studied in my research, I focused on trying to establish theological conversation between Palestinian and North American indigenous understandings of land. And related to your question, I think I came across one of the most parallels that are done between these two contexts is paper written by Robert Allen Warrior called Canaanite Cowboys and Indians, and Naim Ati's first book on Justice and Only Justice, where they critique liberation theology, right? I mean, in liberation theology is this theology that's elevating the poor, that's bringing kind of the marginalized to the front line and directing the good news towards them, right? What is the good news for the poor? I don't know yet if they knew each other or they've met, but the way they critique our reading of the Exodus story, which is kind of foundational for liberation theology, really reflects a blind spot there too. Because in their own words, like they say something like, if you are reading the story and you put yourself in the Israelites' place, in some ways you are elevating God the conqueror. And I think that's a recurring theme in our reading of scripture. Is our God the God of conquest, or is he the God of the liberation? And for me, that was really a point to think of it through, because when we read, who do we see ourselves in? Who do we read into the text? And what is our understanding, our theology of God based on that? And I think we have to be careful sometimes not to rush into kind of the victorious place and the victorious role, but look also what does that mean for the others in our readings. And the Bible is very binary many times, like uses this either or language, and it's a bit tricky because our reality isn't either or, right? We're not a black or white. There's a lot of gray areas.
Shadia, any other examples of nonviolent resistance that's creative and clear that you'd like to highlight?
I think, on a smaller scale, even with what's been going on in the last 9 months in Gaza, like I've been really inspired watching how Palestinian Sumud is so innovative and is so strong, right? Whether I remember in March, I think, when baby food was no longer available, so mothers had to be innovative. I mean, I know it's not, we don't know yet how that is going to affect the children, but right, trying to feed children dates or creating some shelter for them. Or I think there's a story about creating a process to make seawater drinkable and just creating their own system to try to desalinate the water. I think again and again, you see the power of life, the power of persevering and wanting to go forward despite the darkness that people are currently living in again and again.
You mentioned Samud. I think that is such an important phrase and concept to understand Palestinian identity and existence, but I'm not sure it's one that all of our listeners will be aware of. How do you define this idea of Samud?
Yeah, a sumud, it's an Arabic word that means perseverance. It's one of the phrases that kind of is particular for Palestinian perseverance against all the injustice that they've been suffering ongoing, whether it's in very violent situations like what is happening right now, but it's also that slow process of persevering regardless of how much injustice you are suffering, whether you're unable to access your land, but you find ways to do that, or whether it's inability to provide for your family. So you kind of become very, again, creative and to reimagine ways to withstand the circumstances that you are facing. I think it's something that it's built in us. That's something it has to do with just our will to live, our will to survive. For many Palestinian Christians, I think it's also coming from our faith. Our faith is the place that gives us, that nourishes our sumud in many ways to persevere against all odds.
It's making me think of this idea that even just steadfastly existing is a form of resistance. It's asserting those different identities and continuing to try and live a flourishing life in spite of seemingly insurmountable violence. I want to talk a little bit more about that idea of the role of storytelling. It's part of the work, I think, of Samud, of creatively resisting injustice, of transforming cultural violence, and eventually transforming structural violence. What role for you does storytelling play in advocacy? And I'm wondering if you can talk especially a little bit about your Women Behind the Wall podcast.
Sure. I mean, I think storytelling is something that's embedded in us. And even in my work in peace building, it was firstly, tell your story, right? Everyone has a story to tell. And really that's been a stronghold in Palestinian Christian meta narrative, if you want to say, like, this is kind of our approach. And if you look at the first wave of Palestinian Christians, it was primarily Palestinian clergy who have elevated their stories. They basically just told their own story of what happened to them, and whether it's in the Nakba 48 or in 67 and so on. And I think there is a power to telling your story. Your story is your own personal experience, and that it opens a window for people to listen to your story, and it doesn't become kind of your opinion, or what that people can counter it, but it's actually allowing for people to listen to your story, to understand where you are coming from. And in that same spirit, I think for me, the main, like one of the points was 2014 was very formational, or that was kind of my crossroad point where I had to really reconsider a lot of my approach towards what I was doing for peace. And at the time, it was one of the bigger violent cycles that happened between Gaza and Israel. And I think there were many people that had similar realization that we are stuck in an endless cycle of violence that's only going to become more and more brutal, and rightly so. We're seeing it happen live right now. And I think at the time I was trying to see, like, who's speaking up, who's saying something about it, just looking at different outlets for my community. And I noticed that a lot of the opinions and a lot of the statements were coming from men. And so the question that I had was like, well, women have something to say too. And seeing that the existing platforms or the content didn't really reflect that, me and two other friends, we said, let's create this platform where women, also Palestinian women, get to tell their stories. And so the project of Women Behind the Wall, we reached out to some of our acquaintances and said, we wanted to do this. Would you be willing to tell your story? And it's basically, again, like the format was, we didn't want to comment. We didn't want to analyze. It was just letting them tell their stories, and then just intersecting it with their context, with the conflict, with their faith, and also, of course, as women, what is their perspective?
Shadia, I'd love to pick up that theme of women. You mentioned that at the beginning when you were talking about different identities you hold, right? You chose intentionally to center the stories of women to highlight some of these deeper structural issues. And historically, women have been sidelined and excluded from most of the mainstream negotiation and advocacy approaches and organizations. That's changing slowly. I will say not fast enough. But beyond that, the insights and roles women play are often undervalued, both when it comes to experiencing violence every day, but also in leading initiatives that creatively and clearly resist injustice. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on why in your work, but also just in general, it's essential to center the voices and leadership of women when it comes to doing this work collectively.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point, and I think in some ways it's a blind spot in many contexts. It's a fact that women don't have their participation in leadership doesn't reflect their demographic weight. I think there's many social, religious structures. Again, we're talking about structural systems that kind of don't enable people to have the same access to leadership. In my context, I think again, I mean, Palestinian society is an Arab patriarchal society, and I think it's the same to say about Western society to some degree, especially in the church context. There's still a lot of patriarchy there, and I was able to become a leader not because I was working in the parachurch context, and I think there's more access there. There's more opportunities for women to become leaders, whereas in the church, in my experience, there isn't that opportunity as well. And as I was growing into that role of leadership, I noticed that there's not a lot of women there. And the question of why then, right, comes more important and more crucial to ask. And I think there are many reasons to consider. I think in general, the church is still behind to try to kind of get more women in leadership. But I think it's also women are busy because they have their domestic duties. And in addition to if they're women of career, like their time is very constrained. And so not many are able to navigate all of these responsibilities and also be in leadership. And like you said, I think if you look at the news and how Palestinian women are reported, I mean, our places to be victims, where numbers to be counted of how many women and children have died, and that's really taking a lot of agency from our lives and from, what our role is in our societies. And I think, again, that question for me is always who is on in the leadership table, and why not? And the question that it's always on my mind is like, where are the Palestinian Christian women leaders, especially in the church context? I mean, even if you ask yourself, when you hear about Palestine in the church, who's usually telling you the story? Who's really speaking up? And I think predominantly it's primarily men. And the question we have to ask ourselves is why? Are we enabling that same system, or are we trying to counter it as well? Giving a more holistic view of what's going on and different people's experiences there.
And I think that's an invitation for our listeners today, is to keep seeking out those voices and stories. They're there. And part of this is helping platform or helping elevate those. You often hear that idea, right? Oh, we speak for people who are voiceless. Nobody's voiceless, right? Everyone has agency and voice, but we can give people microphones or give them access to platforms to share their stories. And I think that that's something everyone on this call can do, is continue to look for those stories and perspectives that might not be the first ones that you come across, and to elevate them, even as we advocate for the transformation of all of the deeper violence. We've touched on a couple of these themes of hope. You mentioned it when you talked about your personal theological formation and some of these other pieces. But I'm sure you also often get asked that question, what gives you hope? At Telos, we often talk about what Reverend Mitri Raheb says, that hope is what you do. But recently, my colleague David Kadaba has also put forward, or helped us think about this through a new frame that invites us to think about how we become a people of hope. And David invites us to think about this as requiring three things: lament, imagination, and action. And part of the call of peacemaking as a way of life for courageous people is to both see the world the way it is, naming the injustices, right? Lamenting the ways that we are implicated in them, but then also to have an imagination of what can come. I think you've offered us some insight into that, right? Elevating the role of women in leadership when it comes to advocating. This idea of samud, right? What does it look like to live that out more publicly? I'd love for you to think or talk about any of those different pieces, lament, imagination, or action, and how you think about or understand how all of those go together when it comes to hope.
I love that format of like looking at hope in terms of lament, imagination, and action. And I think as a Palestinian Christian, I think even during my career path, it's always been that question: what is God's message of hope to the Palestinian people? Right. And I think it's a big question to ask, especially considering suffering. We're trying to make sense of suffering in many ways. We want to see it redeemed. We want to see like that, not that we need to suffer, but suffering is happening. And so where is the message of hope? When we read scripture, when we commemorate certain sacred rituals in our faith. And I think for me, even though now, like since the last 9 months is asking that question, like, where are you, God, right? Where are you, God? And why are you silent? And I think these are forms of lamenting, forms of sitting with the pain of seeing things happen, and you're seeking out an action, a response from Creator. And I think it's, for me, I think a lot of it has been to a form of sitting with the discomfort, being able to say, I am feeling hopeless today. I don't know how to see beyond darkness right now. But I think this also slowly, and maybe I didn't realize that it's also, you're creating space for yourself to reimagine. You're giving yourself that permission to acknowledge what's happening, but then also give yourself that space to try to move forward with it. And I don't know. I mean, I think I tried as an academic. I tried to read more and to see how others. We are not the only people who have suffered greatly. So, like looking at other contexts, I think, and seeing how they grapple with hope has been in some ways part of that journey, that exploration. I did delve into like Jürgen Moltmann's books on theology. I found it very helpful in some ways to kind of think about hope as the ability to reimagine the impossible. right? And there's this anticipation. Hope gives us that willingness to, or that openness to anticipate, but also I think affirming that point of our actions. Like what we do today it reflects our ability to imagine a different tomorrow. And there's a lot of power in that, even when we commemorate Easter or Christmas, right? Like that peace on earth coming, that reconciliation that happened should give us that ability to reimagine a different reality that we're living in today. I mean, also reading Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, trying to just understand, like, how are we capable? How can humanity be capable to do so much violence to one another? I think it's helped me humanize people, but also try to understand where they're coming from. How can we be so violent? Where is violence coming from? And in some ways, I think that's been the reason there's been so much outcry to what is happening in Gaza, because people want to understand why so much brutality and why so much violence, in order to, again, to give us that space to reimagine differently. And so I think in my journey, we always have to counter dominant theologies that are harming us, right? Like Christian Zionism is harming Palestinian Christians directly. So a lot of Palestinian Christians you will see will be countering that, trying to locate themselves in relation to these dominant theologies. And for me, I just got tired of it. I got tired of identifying myself of who I am not. And it opened up my question is, well, then who am I? How can I identify myself with something life-giving as opposed to just constantly being against this ideology or this theology? And I think that's, for me, giving me a lot of hope to kind of seek those answers within, looking at my own Palestinian writing, looking at Palestinian ways of being, Palestinian ways of living, whether it's through storytelling. And I don't know, for me, this has been giving me a lot of hope, especially getting to know more about the indigenous context in North America. And honestly, I must also say that I wasn't very familiar with it, aside from just basic things. And the more I became more informed about it, and I'm still in my learning journey, I think there's a lot there that is life-giving. And in a simple format, like indigenous peoples in North America have suffered for more than 500 years. And so for a Palestinian history, which is about 100 years, there's a lot to learn there. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to be exchanged in our survival or in our resistance and our sumud. And I think for me, that path has been very healing in a way. But again, like the past 9 months, I've moved to Canada. That's where I'm doing my studies. And I thought I kind of could leave it behind and give myself some of that distance to really engage in this learning process. But, what's happening in Gaza has become global. It affects everyone, regardless of where they are. And there is that. Now is the time to act. Now is the time to push our leaders to do a ceasefire. And I think it's again, it goes hand in hand. Like we don't have that privilege to just learn in a vacuum, but we have to really keep pushing forward. And I'm sure I'm speaking at a privilege that I'm safe. My family is safe, but there are others, my friends and their families are not, and they're still trying to seek place of safety in Gaza. And really, the story of the Christian community there is really close to us, and we pray and we try to advocate for Gazan Christians, but as well as the Muslims there, that of their right to safety, their right to protection, and doing all we can to kind of push for a cessation of fire.
That's such a powerful place to land, Shadia. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing so much of your personal story with us today, as well as your insights and that call to action. I think for all of us who have listened and learned, right, there's an immense call, or as you named it, a vocation for us to figure out what it looks like to become peacemakers, to address cultural, structural, and direct violence, and to use our privilege to amplify our own voices alongside those that have been marginalized, to advocate for what at Telos we call mutual flourishing, a future of freedom, dignity, and security for Israelis and Palestinians in equal measure, not at the cost of one another.
I'm comfortable enough to be in these tensions, in these places that maybe it's more about the journey than it is knowing what the outcome is. But that's what solidarity is. That's what activism is, right? It's our communal effort to reflect our understanding, our love, our peace in a specific community. And so I think, again, resonating with the call that we need to be in solidarity with each other to try to make our realities better, to reimagine how we can be a hope for other peoples, especially those who are marginalized.
Shadia, I'm so grateful for the time you took to be with us today to share your story and insights into what goes into nonviolence and creative and clear resistance to injustice. You've given us a lot to think about, and whether in our theologies, our communities, or our political advocacy, there are ways that all of you listening today can harness your agency to work for just peace. And I invite you to explore what a peacemaking vocation can look like for you personally, even as you keep using your voice to advocate against injustice and violence, and for the necessary transformation that leads to mutual flourishing.